Completing the square is a method used to turn a quadratic equation from a standard form to vertex form. And we know vertex form is important for giving us the vertex, the axis of symmetry, and the optimal value. So just a quick refresher here. Your vertex is h, k. H would represent your axis of symmetry and k would represent your optimal value, which you would know is a maximum or a minimum based on if the parabola opens up or down, and that is based on the value of a. So our goal is to go from this standard form into this vertex form. And just looking at vertex form should guide your steps. And what I first noticed is that a is factored out. So that's going to be our very first step. Step 1, factor out a. And you're only going to factor out a from the first two terms. So let's do this first step with our first example on the right. So the a value is 3. I'm going to factor out the 3 from the first two terms. Now, I'm not going to factor out the x, even though it is common to those two terms, because I want you to notice that our bracket is squared, which means at some point we're going to be factoring a perfect square trinomial, which means I need to keep it quadratic in my bracket. And the reason I'm not factoring out the 3 from the last term is because notice we have this k value at the end, which means there's going to be a constant at the end. So what's the point of factoring out the a value from the last term if it's going to become k at some point? So step 1, let's factor out the 3 and only the 3 from the first two terms, which means I'm going to be left with x squared plus 8x. And then on the outside, plus 8. Okay, so we dealt with the a value. Now, the next thing we need to deal with is the fact that this bracket is squared. So I need to create a trinomial inside this bracket. And I can't just add a number in there without changing anything else. So I'm going to figure out this magical number that I'm going to add and subtract to the bracket. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the coefficient of x, divide it by 2, and square, and that's always going to be the process. So step 2, take coefficient of x and divide it by 2, then square it. So I'm going to take this 8, divide it by 2, and raise it to the power of 2. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. So this magic number, I'm now going to add and subtract it to my bracket. So step 3, add and subtract this number to the bracket. So I'm going to write y equals 3 bracket x squared plus 8x. Now I'm going to add the 16 and subtract the 16, and then the plus 8 outside. I need to add and subtract because technically 16 minus 16 is 0. I haven't actually changed anything, but if you look at this trinomial at the front, you will notice x squared is square rootable and 16 is square rootable. And this number 16 will always be square rootable because we made it square rootable when we did this, when we squared our number in the previous step. So this trinomial at the beginning is very important to us, which means this negative 16 at the end of the bracket is useless. We need to kick it out. And to kick it out of the bracket, we just need to multiply it by 3. So step 4, distribute the a value into the last term in bracket. So 3 bracket x squared plus 8x plus 16, and then 3 times negative 16 is negative 48, and then the plus 8 from the end. Now, these two terms, when I collect them, will become k, and this bracket is a perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to factor it and then you're done. So step 5 is going to be collect like terms for k and factor the perfect square trinomial. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So it will always be a perfect square trinomial, even if you have a decimal or a fraction or anything, you made it square rootable. So the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 16 is 4. If we remember, we take the sign of the middle term and it's positive. So I'm going to write x plus 4, and then don't forget that exponent of 2 outside the bracket. And then negative 48 plus 8 is negative 40. There you go. We have our vertex form. And our vertex is negative 4, negative 40. And our parabola opens up because of that positive 3. So again, if you just look at what your goal is for vertex form, it should guide your steps. So once again, we need to kick a out to get it in front of the bracket. So step 1 is factor out the a. Then if you just continue looking at vertex form, you see a bracket squared, which means you need to create a perfect square trinomial. And we do that by taking that coefficient of x. You're always going to divide it by 2 and then square that number. Okay, and then the whole point of that was to add and subtract and know the logic why we're adding and subtracting, because that simplifies to 0. So we actually haven't done anything. We haven't changed anything. But now we have this perfect square trinomial at the beginning, which means we can kick out the negative value by distributing the a value in. And then your final step, collect your like terms and do your perfect square trinomial factoring, which just means square root the outside terms and take the sign of the middle term. So let's practice this 3 times, and then I promise you'll get more efficient with it and everything will click. So let's try our second example. Y equals 2x squared minus 12x plus 5. Step 1, a. Factor it out because we want it outside our bracket. So I'm left with x squared minus 6x in the bracket, and the plus 5 just chills, it does not change. And remember, we're not factoring out the x because we want to keep it quadratic in the bracket. So now we're going to take this coefficient, this negative 6, divide it by 2 and square the value. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3, and when you square that, it will be positive 9. So the whole purpose of that was to add and subtract it to our bracket. So I'm going to add 9, subtract 9. Now this trinomial is super important to me. That's going to become my bracket squared, meaning the negative 9 is useless. So I'm going to kick it out by multiplying it by that 2. So I'm being selective of what gets kicked out and what stays in. So 2 times negative 9 is negative 18. And don't forget the plus 5 is still there. Now, let's collect our like terms to get k, and let's factor the perfect square trinomial to get our bracket squared. So, the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 9 is 3. I take the sign of the middle term and it's negative, so I'm going to write x minus 3. And then don't forget this is quadratic, so our bracket has to be squared. And now we can collect our like terms at the end. Negative 18 plus 5 is negative 13. So our vertex is positive 3, negative 13. And our parabola opens up. And our axis of symmetry is x equals 3. And if our parabola is opening up, that means we actually have a minimum of negative 13. So there it is, properties and completing the square. I want you to try this next one on your own. So we have y equals negative x squared plus 4x. Now you might say there's no constant. That's okay. Let's write plus 0. And now, before I let you go try this off, there is a negative 1 for the coefficient of x squared. You're going to factor out negative 1 from the first 2. So your first step will look like this. And be careful, when you factor out that negative 1, it's not going to be plus 4x, it's going to be minus 4x. and then the plus 0 at the end. Now this plus 0, you don't have to write it if you're comfortable without it there. But if you want it to look more familiar, like what we've done the past 2 times, write it. Okay, pause the video and try this off. Find that magic number to add and subtract, and then go from there. All right. So we need to take this -4 to find the magic number we're going to add and subtract. So -4 divided by 2 is -2. And when I square that, I get +4. So I hope that we not only added the 4, but subtracted it as well. And now I don't need the negative version, so I'm going to kick it out. And I hope you are very careful with your sign. And -1 times -4 is +4. And I'm not going to write the plus 0 anymore because I know 4 plus 0 is still 4. So now we can just do our square rooting, the square root of x squared and the square root of 4. So that's x and 2. The middle sign here is negative. So I'm going to write x minus 2 all squared and then plus 4. So your vertex is +2, 4. We're opening down because of that negative. And if our parabola opens down, that means we have a maximum. And it's a maximum of 4. And then that axis of symmetry, the line that cuts the parabola in half, is at x equals 2. And make sure you do write it as an equation, not just 2, because it is a line, so it needs an equation. All right, for the last one, we do have a fraction for our a value, and we're just going to deal with it. We're going to factor out that 1/2. So let's go ahead and do that. So y equals 1/2. I know it's going to be x squared plus. Now the coefficient here of x is 1. So I'm doing 1 divided by 1/2. And when I'm dividing by a fraction, I'm actually multiplying by the reciprocal, which means I'm actually just doing 1 times 2 over 1, which is 2x. Okay, or you could have thought, what should I multiply 1/2 by so that I get 1x at the end? And 1/2 times 2x will give me 1x. Okay, either way works. And now you can continue with the process. So I want you to go ahead and pause the video and try it out. You will end up with a fraction for your k value. I will tell you that now. Just deal with the fraction, use your knowledge of fractions, getting a denominator, all of that. So go ahead and do that. All right, so we're gonna find that magic number here. We're gonna divide 2 by 2 and then square it. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 1 squared is 1. So we're gonna add and subtract 1 to our bracket. I do not need the negative version, so I'm going to kick it out. And when I kick it out, I'm going to get -1/2. Now I know I'm going to have to subtract -1/2 and -3, which means I need a common denominator because I'm dealing with a fraction here. So I'm going to turn -3 over 1 into something over 2. So I'm going to multiply top and bottom by 2 to get -6 over 2. And now it's ready to go, and I'm going to simplify my k really quickly. And now for my perfect squared trinomial, I'm going to square root x squared. I'm going to square root 1. This middle sign is positive, so hopefully you wrote x plus 1 squared. And then please be careful here. You have -1 minus 6. That's -7 over 2. I hope you didn't write -5 over 2 because then you ignored the sign in front of the 1, which is not good. Remember, they're a team. So there's your vertex form. Your vertex is -1, -7 over 2. Our parabola is opening up because of that 1/2, which means there's a minimum of -7 over 2. And then your axis of symmetry is at x equals -1. So there it is. Completing the square is a method to get your vertex and to get your standard form into vertex form. And remember, you can also find the vertex by averaging the zeros. Now we have 2 methods. You use what's most convenient in each scenario.